Welcome back, everybody. I'm Larry Kudlow, and let's get right to it. We've got a great interview here. Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, who I will say editorially had a spectacular rollout and speech at Liberty University announcing his candidacy for Republican Party nomination to become president. So first up, Senator Cruz, thank you for your time, sir. I know you're a busy chap.
Well, Larry, it's great to be with you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for your leadership every day on basic free market principles that somehow the current administration in Washington seems to have lost sight of.
Well, you got that right, sir. Let me just ask you, before we get to the economic stuff, Iran on the front page again and again and again. And I wrote a column, Senator, and I'm saying the following. They may make a deal or they may not make a deal. It looks like it's going to be a terrible deal. But look, just supposing, sir, that they make a deal that postpones nuclear weaponization for 10 or 12 years. Just suppose that for a second.
Right.
Nobody is talking about the fact that Iran every day and every day after that and every day after that continues to operate terrorism throughout the Middle East and continues to march towards taking over the Middle East. We aren't linking these negotiations to that. We're not saying we're going to toughen the economic sanctions if you don't change your terrorist hegemonic behavior. Senator Cruz, why are people overlooking this? That's the day-to-day problem, is what they're doing to us in, Israel, Lebanon, Syria. They want to take over Iraq. They want to take over Yemen. They want to take over Saudi Arabia. You tell me.
Larry, you are exactly right. This deal from the Obama administration is a catastrophic deal, and it is extraordinarily dangerous. And the alternative, I mean, you quite rightly pointed out that Iran is the leading state sponsor of terrorism in the world, and you're right that most people are not focused on that. I introduced legislation in the Senate that demonstrates how I think we ought to be approaching that. And the legislation that I introduced would immediately reimpose sanctions, would strengthen the sanctions to make them even more crippling. And then it lays out a simple path for Iran to lift the sanctions. Number one, they would disassemble all 19,000 centrifuges that they've built. Number two, they have to hand over all of their enriched uranium. Number three, they have to shut down their ICBM program, which is for one purpose and one purpose only, and that's to carry a nuclear weapon to the United States of America. And number four, exactly the point you just raised, they have to stop being the leading state sponsor of terrorism in the world. That's actually how a strong commander-in-chief would approach this. When you are dealing with religious zealots and bullies like the Ayatollah Khamenei, you need a lot more stick and a lot less carrot. And what we're doing now, the idea that this administration, the Obama administration, is facilitating a nation that routinely leads chants of death to America, we're facilitating their getting nuclear weapons, is extraordinarily dangerous and foolhardy.
The only people, Senator Cruz, who I've read talking about this is the Kissinger George Shultz op-ed was very good.
Yes.
We have General Jack Keane on periodically here. He's a great friend of the show, and he's taught me so much. But there has to be linkage. The economic sanctions have got to be linked to Iran's terrorist behavior. And Obama won't do that. From day one, remember he gives these speeches. Jack Keane, let me just ask you, I don't mean to get too worked up. I want to hear from you, not me, but I'll just add this point. General Keane said to me that Obama has had a grand bargain vision from day one in 2009 where he would accommodate Iran, make a big deal with Iran, all right, a détente with Iran that would allow the United States to get out of the Middle East. And I think that détente business, which continues to surface, has created such a powder keg, Senator Cruz, that this is, this could be the biggest blow-up in the history of American history.
You are exactly right. Just in the past few weeks, a senior Iranian general has publicly said the destruction of Israel is, quote, non-negotiable. Just in the past few weeks, Iran carried out a military exercise where they set up a ship, an American military ship, to bomb, to practice. They're doing this while negotiating. in the midst of this, last year, Khamenei in Tehran said to a publicly assembled mass that America is the greatest human rights violator on the face of the planet, a flat-out lie. The response was the crowd began chanting in unison, "Death to America." Every year, they celebrate as a holiday, Death to America Day. You know, we have Thanksgiving, Christmas, the 4th of July. Death to America Day in Iran is the anniversary of Iran's seizing American hostages. And, you know, if history teaches anything, it is that if somebody tells you they want to kill you, believe them. And unfortunately, the Obama administration is unable to perceive the threat. The reality is this president is perfectly fine with a nuclear Iran. He is looking for what he thinks is a domestic political accomplishment of a deal, and it is extraordinarily dangerous. It is the greatest threat to American national security and also to the security of our allies.
But I think, sir, I would say this. Yes, the nuclearization or the nuclear weaponization is an unbelievable threat to the region, to America, to mankind. But what I'm also getting at is Iran's day-to-day terrorist behavior is a great threat. They are basically, look, Kissinger and Schultz, two very distinguished Americans, you know, they're saying they are trying to take over the Middle East. They want hegemonic power, and the Saudis know that. We're not dealing with that aspect. The economic sanctions, Senator Cruz, have hurt them a lot. And like you said, I would toughen those economic sanctions, and I would link it to their daily terrorist behavior. It just seems so obvious to me. I'm just a dumb TV and radio guy. If I know it, why don't smart guys know this?
You are absolutely right. And it's not just the Middle East, by the way. They're also spreading terrorism throughout Latin America. I mean, Iran's hegemonic desires. It is getting more and more potent, and this administration is facilitating it. And it's one of the reasons. You know, what's striking is, ironically enough, Obama has managed to unify Israel and the Arab world. They're both united that this Iran deal is tremendously dangerous because they're seeing what Iran's doing firsthand.
We thought we'd never see the day. You're right. It's just Sunni Arabs are now uniting with Israel. You're right. Maybe that's a little bit of good that's happened. All right, Senator Ted Cruz, I got so many questions. I got to ask you to do a lightning round because we've got just so much, but I appreciate your thoughts on Iran. Sir, you had a great speech. I read it very carefully. You mentioned Ronald Reagan. I don't know if you mentioned JFK, but it was a very JFK-like speech. You mentioned FDR and his optimism. Senator, what's your economic vision here? You know, our economy is growing at half the rate, 2%. We should be growing at 4%. Growth solves a lot of problems. In brief, Senator Cruz, what would you have us do if you were president?
Well, Larry, you are exactly right. The number one priority has to be growth, growth, and more growth. And it is, if you look at the federal budget, and you know this well, there is only one first-order variable. There is only one variable that dramatically affects the budget, and that is economic growth. Since World War II, our economy has grown on average 3.3% a year. There are only two 4-year periods where growth averaged less than 1% a year. 1978 to 1982, coming out of Jimmy Carter, and 2008 to 2012, where in that period growth averaged 0.9% a year. The critical objective for the next president is to bring back economic growth. If we can get back to historic levels of growth, 3, 4, 5%, the entire picture turns around. Now, the way to do so, what you understand well, is principles of cause and effect. Every time we pursue the current economic policies of out-of-control spending and taxes and regulation, what results is stagnation and misery and malaise. Likewise, every time we pursue the policies of tax reform and regulatory reform, every time we reduce the burdens of government on small businesses that are creating 2/3 of the new jobs in the economy, we have seen incredible growth in jobs and opportunity. We saw that in the 1920s. We saw that in the 1960s under JFK. And as you know, JFK was an extraordinary advocate for tax reform a voice that is now sadly dead in the Washington Democratic Party.
I'm writing a book on this. JFK was the first supply sider. He went, and Reagan took it from JFK. But you talk about a flat tax in your speech, much to my delight. Just quickly, sir, what are you thinking here on the flat tax? Because I've seen some weird tax plans. I think Senator Rubio, who's a very good man, is nonetheless gone off the rails on his own tax policy. Senator Rand Paul, another good man, has not really delivered. You're talking about a flat tax, more or less. What would the rates be?
Right. So what I support is a flat tax. We have not rolled out specific tax legislation. We are working on that right now. So I promise you we will have a specific tax plan with the details. And we're right now, as you know, there are trade-offs in terms of what level of rate, what level of standard deduction you have initially.
Yep.
If you have, there are debates, for example, do you have one or two exemptions? How you set it up, there are trade-offs that we're going through right now. What I think is important is that it be a simple flat tax where every American can fill out his or her taxes on a postcard. And that it be one uniform rate for everybody. And the most important reason for that, there are huge growth benefits, but the most important reason for that I think is something actually even more important than economic growth, which is that it makes Washington less relevant.
Right.
The tax code right now is the greatest avenue of crony capitalism, of strengthening Washington politicians, because every carve-out in the tax code, as you know, the entire Washington lobbying apparatus, there's nothing it focuses more on than the tax code. And a simple flat tax means politicians can't shake down the private sector for campaign support because everyone's paying the same simple flat rate that is fair for everyone. And then it lets the private sector compete, and the way you do better is you build a better mousetrap rather than acquiring power and influence in Washington.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. I mean, that besides growth, it's that power shift that's so important. You also, it's funny, reading your speech, you talk about upholding the sacrament of marriage.
Yes.
I'm a Catholic convert myself, and I think marriage is very important. But I want to ask you a more generic question.
Sure.
Can you, as president, stop government assistance and government welfare, which is A, paying people not to work,
right,
and B, paying people not to marry, which is another way of saying C, causing family breakup, which I think may be the biggest cause of poverty, Senator Cruz. Can we fix that?
We certainly need to. And you are right that the policies of the far left have wreaked devastation, particularly in the minority community. They have been responsible for the breakup of families. And you are not doing anyone a favor by making them dependent on government. The people who have been hurt the most are the supposed beneficiaries of these programs. I've said many times, when my father was a teenage immigrant from Cuba, when he couldn't speak English, when he was washing dishes making 50 cents an hour, thank God that some well-meaning liberal didn't come put his arm around him and say, let me take care of you. Let me give you a check from the government. Let me make you dependent on government. Let me sap your self-respect. Let me sap your individual responsibility. And by the way, don't bother learning English. I respect your culture so much, I'm going to trap you out of the business and professional classes in this country. That would have been the most devastating thing you can do. In my view, the social safety net should be a trampoline and not a hammock. The entire purpose of it should be people back on their feet where they can work and provide for their families and their kids. That's the American dream. And we just had the budget debate in the Senate. I introduced an amendment in that debate for every welfare program in the federal government to require that able-bodied adults be working or actively seeking work. That the purpose of it should be to help people provide for themselves, not to have them permanently trapped in dependency.
All right. We're talking to Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, who had a very successful launch for his presidential campaign. Senator, a million things I want to talk to you about, but let me go to the more difficult side.
Sure.
Your critics say, okay, Senator Ted Cruz was responsible for the government shutdown in the summer of 2013. He was risking a default on the debt. People are saying in that sense that you are too hardline. You won't be able to work with the Democrats. If you were president, you'd never go across the aisle. Ronald Reagan made deals. Senator Ted Cruz would never make a deal if you were president. What's your response to that criticism?
Well, you're right that there are a lot of people in Washington who are throwing rocks. And what I would say is if you're happy with how Washington is handling the problems of this country, if you want someone who's not going to change things, then there are candidates running who would fit that mold. I think Washington is fundamentally broken. I think we've got to change it, and the only way to change it is to take the power out of Washington and bring it to the American people. And that's really what I'm trying to do. You know, it's interesting that the principles that I'm fighting for are basic common sense principles. Live within your means. Don't bankrupt our kids and grandkids. Follow the Constitution. Anywhere, it is only in Washington, D.C. that those are considered radical and extreme ideas. If you assemble 50 people in any state in the Union, you could have Democrats, Republicans, Independents, Libertarians. Those are basic common sense principles that bring people together. And yet in Washington, there is a corrupt culture, and it is a bipartisan corruption. I've said many times, the biggest divide we've got in this country is not between Democrats and Republicans. It is between career politicians in Washington in both parties and the American people.
But as chief executive,
yes,
would you be willing to go across the aisle? Would you be willing to make compromise deals? You know, I worked for Ronald Reagan, who was a great conservative.
Right.
But Reagan made deals. Now, not all of them were great. Not all of them. He acknowledged a few clinkers, but most of them are pretty good. And so people are just asking that: will Ted Cruz, be a guy who can govern if he were elected?
And the question is, the answer is absolutely yes. You know, a lot of folks in the media like to characterize a conservative as someone who's unwilling to compromise or make deals. You know, my view on compromise is exactly the same as Reagan's. Reagan said, what do you do if someone offers you half a loaf? Answer, you take it, and then you come back for more. And so from day one when I was elected, I said I'm perfectly happy to compromise with Republicans, Democrats, Independents, Libertarians. In fact, I joke, heck, I'll compromise with Martians if, and this is the critical piece, Larry, if we are reducing the size and power of government, if we are expanding individual liberty, if we are fixing the grave fiscal and economic challenges in this country. So I'll give a specific example. Tax reform. You and I talked about a flat tax, which is what I would like to see, a simple flat tax. I'd like to see us abolish the IRS. Now, that's the objective. I would readily compromise on tax reform and accept something that's simplifying the tax code, that is lowering rates, that's reducing the burden, even if it didn't go all the way to a flat tax. I would happily take tax reform, compromise, declare victory, and then come back and say, okay, let's finish the journey and go all the way to a flat tax.
Well, that's what Reagan did. He had one piece in 81 and a second piece in 86. Right. That's interesting. Senator Cruz, we're running out of time. I got less than a minute. Hillary Clinton is announcing tomorrow. God, she's taking a Sunday, for heaven's sakes, and going on the web. How would you defeat her?
The way to win in November 2016 is to run a populist campaign on behalf of hardworking men and women across this country who want to believe again in the promise of America. Hillary Clinton embodies Washington corruption. We got to stand for growth, jobs, opportunity, defending the Constitution, and restoring America's leadership in the world.
Senator Ted Cruz, thank you, sir. Wish you all the best on the campaign trail. Thank you for coming on.